Hello and welcome to Talkernate History, the podcast where we,
Matt.
and Max, discuss works of alternate history scenarios, and history in general. Today, we're going to talk about the much discussed topic of what if the United States owned Canada? Now, I assume that they would acquire it, in the War of 1812 or...
Yeah, that's almost the most logical point, and I think that would make for the most interesting diversions from actual history. It's unlikely, but it could have happened, considering the U.S. Army wasn't really great at the time. It wasn't very well prepared for the war. But if Britain was maybe more caught up in the Napoleonic War and had made some other missteps, maybe the U.S. could have overrun Canada and gotten the whole thing in a peace settlement.
Right. But let's just say they do it. Let's just give it to them. There's a lot of things to keep in mind. Like, let's say the U.S. gets all of Canada. What happens next? Like, how does U.S. digest these acquisitions?
That's going to be really interesting because remember, so let's say the victory comes, let's say they're settling in 1814, which is the year that they actually signed the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the war. That's only 9 years after, it's only 11 years after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. So the U.S. is now, again, probably close to doubling its size. That's some interesting questions because that's all unexplored too. So you're probably seeing some Lewis and Clark type expeditions setting out to see what exactly do we own now? Because I don't know if the British knew too much of what what was out there. I mean, they knew what was in like Quebec and near Toronto, but they didn't know what was up in now. It's like the Yukon or stuff like that.
Absolutely. There's tons of unknown territory out there. And you mentioned Quebec there. I mean, good Lord. Imagine the can of worms Quebec would be for the United States.
Oh, yeah. I think Quebec has always had issues with independence. They've wanted to be independent. There's still a very strong sentiment towards that in the country. Although I wonder if it wouldn't be as bad under the U.S. I'm just saying because the fact that I wonder if a lot of that had sort of stemmed from the fact that they're under control of the British for a long time. And the British are clearly not friends of France or the French people for a long time. So maybe Quebec under the state system, like in the United States, a federal system, is going to have more leeway, and that maybe allows them. There's less of a propensity to ask for independence.
Plus, there is the revolutionary leader in Quebec. I believe his name was Louis-Joseph Papineau.
Yeah, Papineau. Right?
I mean, he himself advocated that all of Canada be annexed by the United States, which would be...
Yeah, well, I mean, particularly Quebec, too. And if the U.S. ever fought a war later in the 19th century, I'm sure that what they would gain would probably be Quebec, if anything, because the British would be like, yeah, here, you take it.
It's your problem now.
Yeah, it's your problem now. But, someone like Papineau, maybe, the governor of Quebec in a world in which the United States owns Canada. And it's interesting because it would have been part of sort of digesting all these new sort of acquisitions, which would have been fascinating to see because the U.S. is growing. So obviously they could accommodate that. But I think this is something too that people don't think about if we're talking about this. But what do the shape of states look like now? Because the U.S. border with Canada was set sort of by the peace of the War of 1812, but it took time afterwards, and especially out west to really settle it. But clearly this, the way it looks now would be different, especially out in the west. What do you think about this, Max?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the map of America, on the northern border, so much of what is up there is just completely arbitrary. Like, it's just based on some line that someone put on a map that nobody really saw the terrain, nobody saw the rivers or the mountains. It's just, okay, one big curved line.
They went on a line of latitude, some parallel, I forget.
Right. It would
45th or 48th. God, I can't remember. Because I know there's 54-40 or fight, and that's from the Oregon Territory later on. But that's farther north of the actual border where it is today.
True. Plus, what would the Canadian states look like? I mean, in real life, the Canadian territories are huge, but they're huge because there's not that many people living in these areas.
I would think something like, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, Ontario, those would probably be the same, although the extent of them would be interesting. Something like what happens to what becomes like Saskatchewan? Is it even called that? Is it like Franklin, the state of Franklin, the state of Columbia? Would British Columbia just be called Columbia? I don't know. that the farther west you go, the bigger the question. And honestly, if you're fast forwarding the present day in a world like this, there very well could be the U.S. could still have very large continental territories. What's the Yukon? Probably won't get populated that much. So is the U.S. still going to have like the Northwest Territory, and it's going to be 2014? I mean, that's silly to think, but there's no reason why not.
Right.
If Canada has it today, there's no reason to believe that them becoming part of the United States would make it so that they would become states. It's still incredibly inhospitable too. But that would also have an advantage for the U.S. for resources, though, in the modern day. That's skipping ahead, with timber and gold and everything and oil.
Yeah, yeah. The Canada is ridiculously rich. Not to say that America isn't. America is absurdly resource rich.
Yes,
It's
but in
just
a different way.
Yeah, it would be even bigger,
They
even
just,
more.
I mean, we have more farmland, but they have lots of incredible, there's just untapped. I think that's why it seems so great in comparison to us, is that I wouldn't say exhausted, but we've tapped a lot of the resources that we have in our section of the North American continent, and Canada just is so huge with so much less people. So I think that the shape of states are going to change, which is interesting. But this is what I think the really meat of the argument is about: is what is this going to do to North-South relations? Right. I think this is a really key question. And Max, what do you think about this?
Well, it would completely change the calculus of something like a Missouri Compromise. I mean, what the hell would you do if you have all this new territory up north with people living in it? Places like Ontario and places like that. Like those places would be part of states. Mm-hmm. Like, how would you determine like the debate about slave states and free states when you have all of these new free states up north?
Well,
to
I think
even that out.
That's going to be interesting, because I think this is going to push the South to be even more aggressive for territory in real life. Than it was in real life, because you had with the Missouri Compromise is that why it worked is that it seemed like that the South was getting an equal share. But in a world in which Canada now belongs to the United States, it's clear that there's going to be way more free states. So the South is probably going to push certainly for expansion into the Caribbean. So I could see people getting up in Congress and saying, we need to buy Cuba, and we need to buy other islands in the Caribbean, or take them by force, because we need to expand. We need to have more slave states, and also Mexico, a Mexican-American war. Clearly, the people are going to push for it. What is this? This is going to be interesting. What do you think about this, Max?
Yeah, I could see that. I could see them seizing Jamaica, since it's a British island, and screw the British. They're a bunch of wimps. We can just take anything we want from those guys, and they're probably going to be very unkind to us at this point. We probably have very bad relations since we took Canada from them.
I feel tense. I think there'd be a lot tenser relations, and I know it took a long time after the War of 1812 for U.S. relations to get better with Britain, and I don't think they're getting better in this. I think it's going to be a lot worse, because it was status quo antebellum in real life, but in a world where Britain gets smacked in the face with a loss, is going to be pretty hard for them to swallow.
Plus, you mentioned going into Mexico. To go back to that, I mean, where do you stop? Do you take all of Mexico? Do you keep on going all the way through Central America? Do you stop at Colombia? Like, when does America end?
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think that very well they may have demanded not more of Mexico, or even all of it. Excuse me, in demand, sort of to make up for all this territory. And this is actually sort of very similar to, if you've ever heard of the Draka series of alternate history books. I think we're going to do a whole episode to talk about the Draka series, because the Draka series is a very interesting take on alternate history. But in that, the United States comprises what we think of the U.S., but also Canada, Mexico, and all of Central America down to the border through Panama, so to the border of Colombia. So basically the entire North American continent. And the story really isn't about that, but it's sort of tangentially mentioned that I think that the South wants more territory for more slave states. So, I think you very well could see a much more expansionistic United States because of this, because they have to make up that difference. I don't know if what that's going to do in the long run, but it's going to be interesting. I feel like people in the South they're already gung-ho in real life about pushing more, but they never got much momentum. But now I think they're going to have a real sort of, bee in their bonnet over trying to push south, because they have a real reason to, because they're clearly going to be outnumbered by the North.
Absolutely. And it really makes you wonder, like, what would a more gung-ho, more expansionist America do? I mean, in real life, America wasn't that expansionist. I mean, they sort of kind of owned the Philippines and they sort of kind of owned Guam and whatnot. But, they took over Hawaii. But other than that, they didn't do a whole heck of a
Yeah, they're going to
lot.
make the Philippines a state.
Clay grabbing, yeah. Oh,
Yeah, yeah.
God.
The U.S. concessions, is Hong Kong now part of the United States?
And something that people really forget about when they talk about new states to the union is that they always think about, oh, the flag's going to look different, and oh,
We can make the stars smaller
oh,
if we want to.
right,
We
right.
can fit more. We can fit more stars. The 70 states of America.
But what they should be thinking about is like the demographic things. I mean, if the United States took over Mexico, then that would mean a huge part of the American population would speak Spanish and not speak a word of English. Like, how would that change Congress?
Well, it's gonna be interesting because are the two major parties still gonna exist? Are the Democrats and Republicans? If they do manage to survive on as the two major parties, they're gonna have to change radically.
True.
Because you're gonna have a lot more of the voting population. I'm sure over time, with the introduction there, that English would become the predominant, would become at least on par with Spanish, and probably in some ways a predominant language. But I mean, obviously, you may see the United States be a bilingual country, but I think it's a question too of like culture change, because remember the United States had a lot of people from different religions. There were Catholics, there were Jews, there were all sorts of people, but the United States was primarily a Protestant country.
Right.
And even till today, it's very, I mean, the United States has become much more diverse, but still there's that underlying sort of like streak of that sort of the people, those are the type of people who, the initial British settlers who came to the, East Coast of the United States. But, with a huge number of Catholics sort of is an influx into the country. Is that changing, how is that going to change sort of the political culture or even the culture of the country itself?
And we're not just talking about Mexico here. I mean, Quebec has a lot of Catholic people living in
Yeah.
it.
And a population that very proudly speaks a language other than English.
Right,
I
right.
mean, they're I know French, Quebecois, I think is what they call it, or something like that. I forget the exact pronunciation, version of French, but very proudly stick to that. So you're seeing is the U.S. becoming more diverse, earlier on, and how is the U.S. eventually going to deal with stuff like if it's down in Central America, like the jungle, they're building, we're going to build the Panama Canal earlier, they're going to build, railways through that. It's going to be interesting,
Right.
But also, we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves.
Right. Let's go back.
Yeah, what is happening with the U.S. Civil War? Now, this is an interesting question because, with these additional free states, is this going to cause extra tension in the war to start, 5 years earlier, maybe? Or I don't know.
I could see that. In addition to that, I mean, if you had very disaffected people, like, once again, Quebec, like, what's to stop Quebec from also saying we'd like to become our own state? We'd like to become our own sovereign nation all to ourselves.
Abraham Lincoln finds himself fighting a war on two fronts.
Right. Like, they're not even associated with the CSA. They're just their own
They
little...
just decide to open. I feel like that would probably be defeated. But it would cause problems.
Oh, yeah.
They sit on the St. Lawrence River, which I'm sure in a world like this would be a very important waterway because it would be a very important trade route. But is the South going to feel maybe more boxed in if they're not getting extra territory in the Caribbean or in Mexico? I feel like they'd be very much more aggressive and very much maybe earlier than 1860, thinking about it's time to form our own country. So maybe then we can form our own empire or something like that.
And you could very easily see them be defeated earlier just because, like, the North would have so many more people in Canada. I mean, Canada was, of course, a lot smaller back then, but still, it's a significant amount of people.
More resources, more people.
Yeah.
I think it's changing. It's gonna change the outlook of this.
But also, I guess the CSA would probably have a lot more support from Britain since, the whole Canada thing that happened.
Could very well could. That'd be interesting to see, or France or anyone.
Mm-hmm.
The French going to be sending, is Napoleon III sending his boats and his men to help out the brave, rebels in the state of Quebec, something like that. I mean, that's a bit silly to think, but if the U.S. is looking like an empire very early on and a real threat, to the hegemony of other, and I'm sure, in a world like this in which the U.S. owns Canada, the Monroe Doctrine would have even more teeth. The idea that, the Western Hemisphere, sort of the U.S. is going to deal with it, police it, don't expand here. Like, I feel like the U.S. is even going to be more aggressive because now we have even more territory and we've successfully defeated a Britain, an imperial sort of power from Europe. But I think it's it's going to be interesting how this will affect stuff like, as you can see, I think the point I wanted to make is that like this one change is reverberating and it's changing the course of American history and the way it looks.
Right.
You know, so. And then finally, also too, I think this is, I mean, actually not finally, but there's two more things I wanted to cover. First is what's happening to the Native Americans here, because now there's even more Native Americans.
Right.
Because I mean, how is the U.S. going to deal with this? Like, this is going to be an interesting issue, because we didn't do a very good job of handling it.
No, we did not.
Didn't have Canada.
And hey, neither did Canada, for that matter. But there's a question like, where do the Native Americans go? I mean, a lot of them ran up to Canada to escape. But
Sitting Bull and all that tried.
If that's also part of America, like where do they have to run to?
Are they going to stand and fight? Like to the last man sort of thing. I don't know. It's an interesting question. And then how's the U.S. going to deal with like native populations like in Mexico and stuff like that, and just like people like, or if they conquered Mexico or stuff like that, it raises a lot of questions that the U.S. would have to deal with. And then finally, what's happening with Alaska here?
That's right. I mean, Alaska was purchased in 1867. And it was actually, contrary to popular belief, a pretty popular measure. I mean, there was a lot of outspoken people saying...
Not just Seward's folly.
Right. That's what people look back on, because it's funny to laugh about how we got such an amazing deal out of this. And people are like, oh...
You're stupid, yeah.
You got ripped off.
Got a bunch of ice. People didn't know there was gold in Alaska. And Alaska was just thought of this big fur trading post sort of thing.
Exactly. When the Russians owned it, there was only... something like 10,000 people living in these colony areas, and they were 100% about fur trading. Like that's all they were good for as far as the Russians were concerned. And to the Russians, they really wanted to get rid of Alaska because they were deep in debt, and they wanted some easy, fast money. Yeah. And hey, why not?
Got it. Yeah.
Exactly.
I think it's interesting too is that I think the question that we're raising from this is the U.S. going to buy Alaska? They have all this territory. Are they going to? Maybe they will buy it. I think it'd be likely that they would buy it from the Russians. But if they don't, are we seeing a Soviet Alaska? Soviet planes flying from their territory into over the United States in the 1950s sort of thing.
Like a large demilitarized zone with barbed wire fields and bunkers built up, deep underground complexes. Here's another question also. What about when the Russian Revolution happens? I mean, are we going to have, are the Bolsheviks going to rise up in Alaska all,
Well, actually, interesting. I wonder, would Alaska, in that case, would Alaska that's still part of Russia be like a haven for white Russians, for people who are opposed to the sort of the government, the Soviet Union? Because it's I mean, it would have been Russian territory, so it's not like they're having to immigrate to another country. But also, that's pretty far away from the sort of main center of Bolshevik power, and it really took years for the Soviets to really get full control over the whole country. I mean, obviously, European Russia was very much in their hands by the end of the Russian Civil War in about 1922. But parts of Siberia probably weren't coming under the control until later. So there's clearly opportunities for those who oppose the regime to get to a place like Alaska, and I'm sure the U.S. and Britain would be very supportive of such a measure.
Yeah,
create some sort of a legitimate Russian government in what was legitimately Russian territory. I feel like we're getting a little off topic.
True.
But
yeah, we are.
Yeah, but maybe that we could talk about that in another episode. But what we're saying is that a U.S. without Alaska, that could be, if history plays out roughly the same. So let's say the U.S. does own Canada, so they have all this territory. But, unless history relatively is the same in Europe, and so we find ourselves with the Soviets on our northern border. And not just, I mean, they already kind of were in real life, but they still there's still some water separating us, and we still had Alaska and all that, but like a hold on the North American continent.
I'm willing to bet that the Alaska today would be a lot smaller than the Alaska of this future, just because I'm sure the United States would be trying to snatch up as much of that clay as possible, because the Russian control of it was pretty tenuous.
Yeah, I'm sure, honestly, in a scenario like this, if the U.S. offered to buy it, the Russians would take it.
Yeah,
in the
they want that money.
So, I think we're sort of finishing up here, but I know this is sort of maybe a shorter episode, but I think it raises interesting questions, and we wanted to show that. We think, oh man, U.S. makes Canada part of it. It's just sort of the same. Not really, because it's sort of starting a cascade of changes so early in American history that it's going to really going to change what this country probably looks like.
That's absolutely true. I mean, if you think back on it, Jefferson gave his take on the War of 1812. I mean, the founding fathers were still alive at this point.
Yeah, I mean, John
A lot
Adams
of
and
them.
Thomas Jefferson died in 1826. I mean, really by 1812, I mean, the only major ones I can think of founding fathers who were dead were Washington and Alexander Hamilton. I mean, most of them were still alive. James Madison didn't die until 1836. So, I mean, these are people who would, it's going to change U.S. history a lot. This isn't just going to be like, oh, they're sort of like us anyway. We just have more territory now. Like, it's going to alter the way the U.S., sort of is and what it is. It's going to, and how it's perceived and all that. So,
Absolutely.
I think we're finishing up, and tune in. Hopefully, next time we will be doing another episode soon, Max.
Yeah, can't wait. Oh, and by the way, if anyone out there has any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please, we implore you, email us at our address, talkernatehistory@gmail.com. So,
This is Matt signing off.
and this is Max signing off.
Have a good day, guys.